On November 12, 1852, at the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans, the most prestigious slave auction house in the American South, something unprecedented happened. An enslaved person was brought to the auction block who was so extraordinarily beautiful that the crowd of wealthy, planters, merchants, and speculators literally gasped. Auction records describe this moment in unusually poetic language, a male of such exceptional beauty and refined features that he appeared almost angelic, with skin the color of caramel, eyes like amber, and a countenance that suggested both strength and delicacy. The bidding started at $500. Within minutes it climbed to $3,000, an absolutely staggering sum, equivalent to over $100,000 today. The final price was $3,200, the highest ever paid for a male enslaved person in New Orleans history. His name was recorded as Alexandre. He was listed as 22 years old, male, quadroon, meaning 1/4 black ancestry, and he carried a secret so impossible, so carefully guarded, so completely at odds with everything the society around him believed about bodies, gender, and identity, that it would only be discovered after his death, nearly 2 decades later. A secret that would cause a legal battle, destroy reputations, and challenge fundamental assumptions about who Alexandre really was. This is the story of the most beautiful male slave ever auctioned in New Orleans, and the impossible truth that he lived with every single day of his enslaved life. Before we begin, I need to warn you, this story involves complex questions about gender identity in a historical context where such concepts didn't exist in the language we use today. It involves exploitation, violence, and the commodification of human bodies. This is real history that reveals how people navigated identity under the most oppressive circumstances imaginable. If you're ready, stay with me. New Orleans in 1852 was unlike anywhere else in the American South. It was the largest slave market in the country, but it was also a city shaped by French and Spanish colonial culture, where racial categories were more fluid than in the Anglo-American South. The city recognized a complex hierarchy: white, Creole, white French, Spanish, free people of color, quadroons, octoroons, mulattoes, and enslaved blacks. Mixed-race individuals occupied a strange middle ground, simultaneously fetishized and oppressed. The New Orleans slave market had developed what historians call the fancy trade, the sale of enslaved people, particularly light-skinned women and occasionally men, who were purchased not primarily for labor but for their appearance, for sexual exploitation, or as status symbols. These auctions took place in the Grand Rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel, where wealthy men bid on human beings while drinking champagne and smoking cigars, treating it like theater. Alexandre was brought to this auction from a plantation in Baton Rouge. Auction house records describe him in extraordinary detail, more detailed than typical slave sale documents. They note his height, 5 feet 9 inches, his delicate hands unsuited for field labor, his refined speech, his ability to speak French, English, and Spanish fluently, his skill at playing piano, and most repeatedly, his exceptional and unusual beauty that defies easy description. What the auction records don't explain is why Alexandre's previous owner, a sugar planter named Etienne Rousseau, was selling him despite his obvious value. There's only a cryptic note in Rousseau's private ledger, discovered decades later. Alexandre proved unsuitable for intended purposes, must be sold despite significant loss. Say nothing of complications. The man who purchased Alexandre for the record-breaking price of $3,200 was Lucien Devereaux, one of the wealthiest French Creole merchants in New Orleans. Devereaux owned a mansion in the French Quarter, multiple commercial properties, and had a reputation for collecting beautiful and exotic things, art from Europe, rare furniture, fine wines, and occasionally, enslaved people who could serve as ornaments to his wealth and sophistication. Devereaux did not buy Alexandre for field labor or even typical domestic service. According to household accounts and testimony from other enslaved people in the Devereaux household, testimony that emerged much later, Alexandre was purchased to serve as Devereaux's personal attendant and to be displayed at social gatherings. He was dressed in expensive clothing, taught additional languages, and required to stand silently in the corner of Devereux's salon, while wealthy visitors admired his beauty like a piece of art. This was dehumanization of a specific, particularly insidious kind. Alexandre was valuable precisely because he was beautiful, but that beauty made him vulnerable to a different kind of exploitation than field slaves faced. He lived in relative material comfort compared to plantation laborers. He slept in the main house, ate better food, was never whipped, but he was still property, still completely controlled, still subject to his owner's absolute authority. For 6 years, Alexandre lived in the Devereux household. Other enslaved people who worked there later described him as intensely private, kind but distant, and strangely careful about his body in ways they didn't fully understand. He always dressed alone. He never bathed when others were present. He was never seen without being fully clothed. When other enslaved men in the household joked about women or discussed their bodies, Alexandre would leave the room. One elderly enslaved woman named Marie, who worked as a cook in the Devereux household, later testified in a legal deposition that she had once asked Alexandre why he was so private. According to Marie, Alexandre responded, "I carry something that, if known, would either free me or destroy me. I have not yet decided. Which I prefer." In 1858, Lucien Devereux died suddenly of yellow fever. His estate went into probate, which meant all his property, including the people he enslaved, had to be inventoried, appraised, and distributed according to his will. Alexandre, still considered one of the most valuable pieces of property in the estate, was to be sold at auction to settle Devereux's debts. But before the sale could happen, Alexandre became seriously ill. It started as a fever, then developed into severe respiratory distress. In October 1858, at the age of 28, Alexandre died in the Devereux mansion. Here's where the impossible secret was revealed. When Alexandre's body was being prepared for burial, a task typically done by enslaved women in the household, the women who undressed him discovered something that shocked them so completely that they immediately went to Devereux's executor, a lawyer named Charles Fontaine. Alexandre had been assigned female at birth. His body, which had been categorized as male for his entire 28 years of life, was anatomically female. The discovery threw the Devereux estate into chaos. Charles Fontaine, the executor, was faced with an unprecedented legal and social crisis. According to Louisiana law and slave codes, the classification of enslaved people, including their sex, was a legal matter that affected their value, their sale, and their treatment. If Alexandre had been classified incorrectly as male when he was actually female, it could mean the original auction in 1852 was fraudulent misrepresentation of goods. Lucien Devereux could claim he'd been defrauded, and the estate could sue Etienne Rousseau's heirs. Every legal document related to Alexandre's ownership was potentially invalid. The unprecedented price paid was based on false pretenses. But there was an even bigger problem. If word got out that the most beautiful male slave in New Orleans history had actually been female, it would cause a scandal that would embarrass every white man who had admired Alexandre's beauty, including some of the most powerful men in Louisiana society. It would raise uncomfortable questions about desire, about the male gaze, about what these men had actually been appreciating when they looked at Alexandre. Charles Fontaine made a decision. He ordered absolute secrecy. The women who had prepared Alexandre's body were sworn to silence under threat of being sold away. Alexandre was buried quickly, with a male name on the grave marker, and the death certificate was falsified to list Alexandre Devereux as male. Only 3 people knew the truth: Fontaine, his assistant, and the priest who performed the burial rites. But secrets don't stay buried forever. In 1871, 13 years after Alexandre's death, a legal battle erupted over the Devereux estate. Heirs of Etienne Rousseau were suing the Devereux estate over an unrelated property dispute. During discovery, lawyers found Rousseau's private ledger with the cryptic note about Alexandre being unsuitable and complications. They began investigating what that meant. The investigation led them to Marie, the elderly cook who was by then a free woman living in the Tremaine neighborhood. She was deposed and told them what she knew: that Alexandre had been intensely private about his body. that the women who prepared him for burial had been traumatized by what they discovered, and that the whole household had been ordered to never speak of it. The lawyers then found the women who had prepared Alexandre's body. 2 had died, but one, a woman named Justine, now in her 60s, gave a sworn deposition. She testified that Alexandre's body had been anatomically female, that there had been evidence of binding around the chest area, cloth wrapped tightly to flatten the chest, and that Alexandre had apparently lived his entire adult life as male despite being assigned female at birth. The revelation created a legal firestorm. The Rousseau heirs argued that Lucien Devereux had been defrauded, that he'd paid a record price for a male slave who was actually female, and that this misrepresentation invalidated the entire transaction. The Devereux heirs argued that Alexandre's sex was irrelevant. He had been purchased as is, had lived as male, and been accepted as male by Lucien Devereux and everyone else. The case, formally titled Rousseau v. Devereux Estate, 1871, was quietly settled out of court after it became clear that public trial would embarrass too many powerful families. The settlement terms were sealed, but the legal documents, including depositions and medical examiner reports, were filed with the Louisiana State Archives and lay forgotten for over a century. So how do we know this story today? In 1991, a graduate student at Tulane University named Dr. Kimberly Rodriguez was researching gender and slavery for her dissertation when she came across the Rousseau v. Devereux case file. She spent the next 8 years tracking down auction records, household inventories, burial records, and oral histories from descendants of people enslaved in the Devereux household. She published her findings in 2001 in a book titled Living Between Gender, Race, and Identity in Antebellum New Orleans, which won multiple awards and brought Alexandre's story to light for the first time in 130 years. Dr. Rodriguez's research raised profound questions that we still struggle to answer. Was Alexandre transgender in the way we understand that term today? Was he intersex? Was he a woman who lived as a man for safety or freedom? Was he someone whose internal sense of gender simply didn't match the body he was born with? We will never know how Alexandre would have identified himself if he'd had access to modern language around gender identity. What we do know is this: Alexandre lived his entire conscious life as male. He was perceived as male. He apparently went to extraordinary lengths to maintain that identity, binding his chest, maintaining absolute privacy about his body, living with the constant fear of discovery. According to testimony from people who knew him, he never indicated that living as male was a burden or disguise. It seemed to be simply who he was. In 1850s Louisiana, there was no concept of transgender identity. There was no language for someone whose internal sense of gender didn't match their assigned sex. There was only rigid, binary categorization. You were male or female based on anatomy, and that categorization determined your entire life. What you could do, who you could be, how you would be treated. For an enslaved person, these stakes were even higher. Your body was literally property. Your sex could determine your value, your type of labor, your vulnerability to sexual violence. Alexandre's choice, or perhaps we should say Alexandre's need, to live as male was navigated within a system that controlled every aspect of his existence. Here's what makes Alexandre's story so impossible, so transgressive. He maintained his male identity across multiple owners, across 6 years in a wealthy household, across illness and death, despite constant scrutiny of enslaved people's bodies. He did this in an era when medical examinations of enslaved people were routine, when privacy was non-existent, when his body was legally not his own. The fact that Alexandre succeeded in living as male for 28 years, including 6 years in close quarters with other enslaved people, and in a household where he was constantly observed and objectified, is extraordinary. It suggests both incredible determination and likely the quiet cooperation of other enslaved people who knew or suspected his secret and chose to protect him. Marie's testimony hints at this. We knew Alexandre was different. We did not know how or why, but we knew he carried something heavy, and we chose not to look too closely because we understood that survival sometimes requires secrets, and those of us who have no freedom must allow. each other the small freedoms we can provide. Alexandre's story challenges our historical narratives in multiple ways. It reveals that gender variance existed in enslaved communities that are often portrayed in simplified, monolithic terms. It shows that enslaved people created spaces of privacy and identity, even within the total institution of slavery. It demonstrates that the people we call male slaves or female slaves in historical records may not have identified with those categories in ways we assume. It also reveals the particular cruelty of the fancy trade. Alexandre was valued for his beauty, objectified and displayed like art, purchased for a record price precisely because he fit white men's ideals of aesthetic perfection. His body was commodified in ways that made his gender identity even more precarious. He was constantly looked at, constantly evaluated, constantly subjected to the male gaze. And yet, he maintained his identity throughout. When Alexandre died in 1858, was he a man? By every measure that mattered to him and to the people who knew him, yes. By the measure of the legal system that enslaved him, it became a question only when it affected property value. By our modern understanding, Alexandre was someone navigating gender in ways that don't fit neatly into 19th century or 21st century categories. What we can say with certainty is this: Alexandre lived as a man, was known as a man, and apparently preferred to be understood as a man, even though his body didn't match the rigid categories of his time. He lived under slavery, the most oppressive system imaginable, and still found a way to be himself. He carried an impossible secret that, if discovered while he was alive, could have subjected him to violence, humiliation, or exploitation. And he protected that secret until the very moment of his death. This is why we tell these stories, because the people we call slaves in history books were complex human beings with internal lives, identities, and struggles that transcend the categories imposed on them. Because gender variance has always existed, even in times and places where it had no name and no acceptance. Because the records that survive often tell us more about the people who created them, the slave traders, the owners, the lawyers, than about the people whose lives those records supposedly document. Alexandre was more than the most beautiful male slave ever auctioned in New Orleans. He was a person who navigated impossible circumstances with dignity, who protected his identity against a system designed to strip all agency from enslaved people, and who lived and died as himself despite everything arrayed against him. If this story challenges your assumptions about history, about gender, about slavery, good. That's what Buried Truths should do. Subscribe to Buried Truths for more stories that reveal the full complexity of human experience, even under the worst oppression. Comment below, what do you think Alexandre would say about his own identity if he could speak to us today? How do we honor people whose gender identity may not fit our modern categories? Share this video with someone who needs to understand that gender variance isn't new, that enslaved people had complex identities beyond their oppression, and that some secrets are kept not out of shame, but out of necessity and self-preservation. The truth was impossible in 1852. We're making it possible now.